So welcome everyone to our final briefing of H&F Climate Carnival Week. This afternoon's session is all about ecology. So now I'm delighted that Councillor Sharon Holder, Cabinet Member for Strategy, is able to join us. And I'll now hand over to Councillor Holder, who will say a few introductory and welcoming words. Councillor Holder.
Hello everybody and welcome to the last of this week's briefings as part of the H&F Climate Carnival. Why are we here? COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference happening in Glasgow next week. What will be agreed in Glasgow will be of global importance, but whatever that is, the actions required to meet it will happen at local level. So the focus of our Climate Carnival this week is on local action. How we as a community can slow down the rate of climate change, acknowledge the benefits from the growing sustainability sector, and what we can do to make it more cost effective. We'll be celebrating the great work already happening in our borough and showing how taking small steps to address climate change can benefit us all through lower energy bills, cleaner air and improved health. This is the last of our daily briefings and today's session is about ecology. Nature-based solutions can greatly help us to tackle the climate emergency. Hammersmith and Fulham, for instance, has 19 world-class Green Flag awarded parks and open spaces. By greening H&F, or Hammersmith and Fulham, like creating mini forests, greening grey pathways, buildings and highways, not only can we help alleviate the ecological emergency, but also help cool our urban spaces, absorb carbon monoxide and reduce flooding. We're going to hear from officers who will talk through some of the projects we're working on, but I would encourage you to visit one of the borough's fantastic parks and green open spaces, especially tomorrow, as several of our parks are putting on Ecology Day events to end the Climate Carnival. For more information about what's happening, visit the Climate Carnival events page on the LBHF website to see the programme, including the Ecology Festival at Lyric Square between 11 and 4 p.m. and a fantastic urban ecology trail that takes you through some of our housing nature projects. Housing nature projects organised by our community engagement team. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We all hope you will come away feeling energised and inspired to take climate action together. Back to you, Emily.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Councillor Holder, for that introduction and for being here this afternoon. So as we've heard, next week, the UK is hosting world leaders for COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, which starts on Monday in Glasgow. And that's why we're running this whole week of events and activities. There are things that, well, we've had things today, but tomorrow is Ecology Day. And that's why we wanted to do this briefing this afternoon, tell you what we're doing in terms of ecology, but also show you the fantastic program of things that are happening tomorrow. So please do have a look at the web link there. So just a brief overview of H&F 2030, which is our climate and ecology strategy that has been recently published. So that sets out the route to reduce carbon emissions. That's from our homes and our buildings. That's the biggest source of carbon emissions in the borough, but also how we move around, how we travel, and moving away from more polluting forms of travel like petrol and diesel vehicles towards walking, wheeling, cycling, public transport, and shared electric vehicles. We also need to eliminate the carbon emissions from the things that we buy and use, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food we eat. But we haven't only declared a climate emergency here in Hammersmith and Fulham, we've also declared an ecological emergency. And this plan sets out our routes to making space for nature and enhancing biodiversity across the borough. So I'm really excited that some of our colleagues today will talk through that. But as we know, climate change, many of the impacts of that are things that we're going to have to adapt to and have to prepare for. So the plan also sets out how we are making people and communities resilient to those changes that are underway. So we will hear from colleagues in our climate ecology team today about an introduction to ecology in our borough, a current project, which is baseline of biodiversity and the nature recovery strategy, as well as some exciting projects around tiny forests. So please do use the Q&A, the chat throughout for Q&A and comments. And I'm now really happy to hand over to Dr. Seb Dunnett, an ecology officer here at HNF. Over to you, Seb.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you very much, everyone, to coming along. We really appreciate it. I know it's the last briefing of the week, and I'm sure everyone's got a bit fatigue of being told what Hammersmith and Fulham are doing on the environment. I certainly haven't, but maybe other people have. So I'll try and be quick and not blather too much. Can I have next slide, please, Emily? So Emily's already talked about our strategy. I've just kind of lifted the vision that we have for ecology in the borough from that strategy. So our vision is that green space is expanded, enriched and nurtured by all, providing a haven for nature and a beautiful public realm. It is properly valued for the benefit it brings, including to biodiversity, clean air, well-being, food, and a safe climate, among others. And I think I just like to highlight the phrase there, nurtured by all. I think the winds of change in the kind of ecological movement is that there's this part devolution of care of our open spaces to the community. There's a kind of trying to foster a sense of ownership of our local spaces, trying to get people involved in green spaces again and wildlife. And part of my role that the Climate and Ecological Emergency Commission kind of set out was trying to kind of rekindle that love for nature. Every time I say that, actually, I get reminded of David Attenborough, who apparently was asked the same question, when did you develop your love for wildlife? And he kind of fired back, when did you lose yours? People are born with that kind of love for nature. We just kind of have to nurture it through kind of intelligent policies. I was actually at the WWF State of the Planet address last night with Cristina Figueres speaking. She was the ex-executive director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Very, very inspiring event. And actually, I was there was a poet there from London, Wilson Oriema, who kind of delivered a poem on kind of community spaces and your local green spaces. And I was actually going to read it, but I've just been reminded that I should probably try and be quick with this. So if anyone has a burning desire to hear it, I'll read it for you at the end. But it was a very, very good poem. So I just thought, in the vein of getting people's emotions going about ecology, I quite always like to see what was everyone's last experience of nature. So I can tell you mine was this week. I've just moved to a house with a garden at last, but it had artificial turf on it, which was terrible. So I ripped it up, turned over the soil, and kind of spread some grass wildflower seed mix on it. And I'm happy to say I've had some growth this week. And for me, that's genuinely thrilling. I know I'm a city boy, and my grandpa would laugh at my soft hands, but it's something that for me was very visceral in the kind of emotion of it. So if you feel comfortable, have a reflection of when your last experience with nature was. Pop it in the chat. We can discuss it later, or just kind of connect with everyone else on the call. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in Hammersmith and Fulham? I'm married to a doctor in the NHS, so I would say there's two A good emergency response always has two prongs, one of which is your kind of short-term interventions that need to be done immediately, and your kind of long-term interventions. So the kind of immediate things that we're doing, kind of shovel in the ground things in the borough are increasing our native tree cover. It's incredibly important to get that mix within the borough. So we've been putting in tiny forests, and Simone is going to be discussing that later on, so I'll try not to spoil that too much. But also we're trying to replace as much as possible our tree stock with native trees as much as possible. We have a kind of historic planting of non-native species that we need to account for. And the other thing is wilding our open spaces. So, you know, we have heavily expanded areas of long grass managed for biodiversity, and I'm sure many people saw our No Mow May initiative. It even got coverage in the French national newspapers in Le Monde because it was part of a wider article about poking fun at the English for losing their love of kind of manicured lawns, but that was quite fun. And then our kind of long-term strategy is reviewing protections that we have within the borough. So we have a small amount of open spaces in the borough, and it's incredibly important as a first step that we protect those as much as possible. And actually, as I'll talk about later, we actually have quite a lot of leniency in terms of our protections in the borough. Next slide, please. So opportunities and challenges of these ecological interventions. I think first and foremost, I will always say nature, you know, is in and of itself is a benefit. I think there's a tendency to try and pin it on other benefits too much, but you know, part of my role, as I said, is trying to foster this feeling that nature for nature's sake is a good thing. But should that not work, as it does for me, you know, we have flood and heat regulation. If anyone was at the breakfast briefing this morning with my colleagues, they were talking a lot about the benefits of that. You know, carbon sinks, cleaner air, improved mental health and physical well-being. There was a fantastic study actually that's, I think it was in Scandinavia, that controlled for various socioeconomic variables to show that boroughs in, or whatever they call the kind of lowest geographical unit in that country in Scandinavia, ones with the highest amount of green space had the lowest cases of COVID, you know, even after controlling for everything else. So incredibly important there. And encouraging innovation. You know, I told Councillor Holder actually that 28% of the borough is vegetated, and her fantastic response to me was, well, that's 72% opportunity to green, which I think's amazing actually. Challenges, so we, as I keep saying, we have limited green space and a lot of competing demands for their use. Higher costs and challenges to viability of urban planting. So, you know, it's costly putting in trees on streets in the borough. It really is. There's a lot of things we have to consider in terms of the lifetime of the tree and the damage that it could do to nearby buildings. Should we be liable for that? So it's all about managing that. We have limited local biodiversity data. The project I'm going to be talking about was an attempt to kind of plug that gap. It's a transboundary challenge usually, in the same way as carbon is. You know, we can't be offshoring our impacts on wildlife to other boroughs. We've got to be working with other boroughs to make sure that they have similar protections in place. Lastly, funding. I've been working in the environment sector for 10 years, and I don't think I've ever not put that on a challenges slide. Next slide, please. I'll just whiz through the final three challenges, one of which is shifting baselines. It's a classic thing in conservation ecology that, you know, the wildlife populations you grew up with tend to be what you think is the norm. So if you speak to anybody who's lived in London for more than 20, 30 years, you know, these species were seen all the time, but they're just not seen anymore. And there's a worry that that can set people's baselines at that and say, well, you know, hedgehogs were never seen in London, so I don't know why we're trying to get them back. Next slide. You know, a lack of knowledge among children at the moment. So I actually couldn't really believe some of the figures on this. So I don't know. I'd encourage people to take it with a pinch of salt. I found it, you know, is a survey that was done. So 83% couldn't identify a bumblebee. I don't know whether they, you know, tricked them with some honeybees thrown in there. But you know, I'd say an oak leaf, 82% can't pick that out. I mean, an oak leaf is quite literally the most quintessential piece of ecology in the UK. Next slide, please, Emily. And then there are other challenges is history, essentially. We have a history of planting non-native species in the borough, and as you're all probably aware, the most environmental thing we can do is to obviously leave them there. But it means that we have this tree mix that is actually quite not doing a lot for biodiversity, and it's going to be tough to try and change that quickly. So urban foresters tend to talk about the 10, 20, 30 rule. That's only have max 10% of one species, 20% of one genus, and 30% of one family. So that's kind of going up through the taxonomic hierarchies. You can see already we've got more than 10% plane trees in the borough. We have more than 20%, prunus, which is the cherries. So it's a challenge to try and overcome that, but we're doing our best. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly take you through a project that we're working on at the moment. We have a kind of draft back from the environmental consultants that we're working with. And there's a phrase in environmental consultancy that you can only reduce what you measure. And I see Jim Cunningham's on the call, and he works with our carbon emission calculations, and he'll laugh when I say carbon's easy to measure. It's at the end of the day, it is a molecule. You can attribute quantifiable amounts of it to certain activities, obviously within a confidence interval. But biodiversity is much more this amorphous qualitative concept. So it's much harder to try and get where we are. But it's incredibly important to evaluate the impacts that our interventions have. So we've been working on this kind of benchmark of our biodiversity within the borough, and I'm going to share some of the draft results from that with you. So next slide, please. So this was a phrase I pulled from the report that we had back. I thought it was quite nice. Local action, local character, national contribution, global solution. So one of the aims that I'm very, very keen to embed in the ecological strategy is that we're contributing with our local action towards global goals. Many of you may not know, but the last decade, 2010, was declared by the UN the decade of biodiversity, and we failed almost every single target we set for ourselves in that decade. It was incredibly bad, and it was largely blamed on a lack of local engagement and a kind of a lack of that groundswell. So I'm very, very keen to have that vertical integration into contributing to global goals, and that's largely why we persuaded the council to sign the Edinburgh Declaration. It's a document with other local authorities worldwide calling on nation states, so countries that have signed the UN Biodiversity Convention, to involve local authorities more and give them more agency in these global goals. And then we can hopefully avoid what we had last time. And then the second point to make is that obviously the climate and ecological emergencies are synergistic, but independent. So climate change affects biodiversity loss affects climate change, but there are some independent drivers. And I pulled that great phrase from the recent conference on biodiversity, which happened in Kunming in China. The first half of it, the second half is happening in the spring. And it's just about trying to fix them both at the same time. And then finally for this slide, I put up how difficult it is to try and put your policy within a kind of a local and a national and an international context. That's the policies that the consultants came back with that might be relevant for trying to slot our recovery strategy into. Yeah, it's difficult. There's a lot of it. Next slide, please. So our draft recovery strategy has two prongs. Like I said, and I don't want to over-egg it, but we don't have a lot of open space in the borough, and certainly within our locale in West London, it's historically it hasn't been as high quality as around it. So we have two prongs that we're really trying to focus on. One is protect and one is connect. So protect is trying to elevate the status of some of our sites so that to make sure that we are protecting as much as possible our sites. And there are two wildlife designations, types of wildlife designation in the UK. There are statutory and non-statutory designations. Statutory are backed by certain legislation. Non-stat obviously not. And within the borough, we actually only have one area, one local nature reserve that's statutory designation, and that's Wormwood Scrubs, and that's the woodland boundary around Wormwood Scrubs. So, I mean, one immediate opportunity there with the biodiversity improvements that are happening when HS2 leave the scrubs is to try to enhance the protection of the meadow area, which I know a lot of the residents around there are incredibly fond of and does a lot for biodiversity within the borough. So, I mean, that's an opportunity right there to try and improve the protections that we have in our borough. Non-statutory designations we have are sites of importance for nature conservation. You know, they don't have the full legal backing, but trying to get them improved means that it's easier for the ecology officer for council and the environment department more generally to push back against any kind of developments that would infringe on that. So there's scope to improve these. And if you look at the Barnes Peninsula just southwest of the borough, you know, they have 3 statutory designations within a space of, you know, a quarter, a third, Hammersmith Fulham. Next slide, please, Emily. So I think this is a little busy, this graph, but I think it does serve a point. So the second prong is connect, and urban ecologists quite like to talk about matrix quality. Now that's nothing to do with Keanu Reeves. It's to do with the quality of habitat between quality open spaces. So it's just about, you know, what kind of trees you have, or bushes, or, you know, various scraps of green space between the more high quality areas, like, for example, Hyde Park to the east of us, or Chiswick House to the west of us, and the wetlands to the southwest. So basically, it shows a big opportunity for Hammersmith and Fulham to act as a corridor between these higher quality green spaces and to improve the biodiversity of our kind of locale. I think it's a great way of focusing our focus of our interventions on these sites. So that's what we're working to do at the moment. We're working to kind of target what we're doing within these sites. So I'm talking with Parks colleagues about trying to improve the planting and the greening that we have in these areas. But it also highlights one of the main challenges of this actually is that most of those red spaces on this map aren't owned by the council. So I've learned from one of the previous briefings that we should say that means that we can influence these areas. You know, we don't directly control it, but we are working with partners to try and green these areas. So that the arrows down the side are Network Rail. You know, that's just that's railway embankments, classically quite good for biodiversity because no one can go there. That central one is greening the heart of Hammersmith Fulham, and that's largely working around greening the Great West Road, which runs straight through Hammersmith Fulham. You know, that's TfL. And then those 2 circles are actually areas where we can do more to try and help residents garden for wildlife. So they're areas of high residential density where you know, interventions at home could really help. So it's all about influencing these other partners that we work with. Next slide, please, Emily. So I've been working with Green Infrastructure for Greater London, or the greatly acronymed GIGGLE, who are our local environment record centre, to analyse green cover in private gardens. I think I'm not good at keeping up with the chat, but I think I saw a flash of one comment about gardens in the borough, and this is kind of to show that. It took about 8 hours to run this analysis for London. That shows 3 million, about 3 million private gardens in London, and the kind of vegetation index, so satellite data of how green it is for all of them. So the average in London over everything, I think, is about 40% green cover in the private gardens. And you can see as you get towards the centre, you know, obviously they get smaller and they get less vegetated. But what I think is interesting about this is that you can see that Hammersmith and Fulham is really part of that central London geography. You know, it's certainly South Fulham is kind of smaller gardens, less vegetated than the north of the borough. I said to Emily, I tried this to be interactive, but can anyone guess the area that we have of private gardens in the borough? I just pop them in the chat. Percentage of the borough's area that are private gardens. I'd just be keen to know what you think, and then I can reveal. But we'll see if that works.
Seb, I completely ruined it. I clicked forward to the.
Oh, did you? Okay. Oh, no. Don't
totally
worry.
Ruined it.
Absolutely. Oh, fine. I'm not looking at that screen. Yes, 17%. So, that is genuinely the same as the kind of open spaces that Hammersmith and Fulham manage. So our parks take up about 10% and other open spaces a further 8%. So, that's things like cemeteries, things that aren't parks but are green, essentially. So allotments, that kind of thing. And it's important to know that I'm not shifting blame onto individuals here. I think that's an important thing within the climate emergency agenda. But I'm just highlighting what a positive force for change residents can be if we kind of gather together and garden for wildlife. And part of what I really want to do is work with colleagues to get out a campaign about gardening in the spring to try and get people to see how the council can make it easier for people to garden for nature. I think that would be a good intervention to make. Next slide, please. Final slide. I don't think I've probably gone on too long. What can I do? I have gone on too long. I can see endless space. What can I do? That's been a thread throughout this carnival, so I'm going to rocket through them. Eat less meat. Honestly, you can't do better than that in terms of your international impact, and it's so easy to do. Number 2, read and share the Dasgupta review. It's a fantastic report. 3, welcome nature back at home and in your garden. And I've split them out because at home it means things like welcome swifts back to your attic space. Number 4, get involved in local green space. Number 5, ask the council for more greening. If you know an area that you want greened, don't assume the council knows about it. There are things that fall through the cracks. There are things that some team manage that don't talk to other teams for any reason. Ask us about them, and we can try and get something going. And that's me, and I'll hand over to Simone. And sorry if I've taken up that time.
No, that's awesome, Seb. Thank you so much. And lots of questions in the chat, so I just want to make sure we have time for Q&A as well. On to Simone, our climate ambassador, who will talk through the tiny forest.
Yes, thank you. Can I just check you can hear me? Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm aware we have loads of questions, so I'll try to talk fast, but otherwise, Emily, please butt in and let me know I need to wrap up. Next slide, please. So what is a tiny forest? Take a look at the picture on the right. Is that what you were expecting? It is tiny, but perhaps not how you picture a forest. But to be fair, these trees are only a year old. So a tiny forest is a forest management method developed by Dr. Kira Miyawaki to make the most of small spaces by packing as many native trees in as small a space as possible. He developed this in the 1970s, and it was a success in Japan, and it quickly spread to a few other countries in Asia. But it's only been recently that this has spread to Europe, and as of today, there are 48 tiny forests in the UK. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce you to London's first ever tiny forest at Hammersmith Park in White City. If you know the area, it's a bit hidden away behind the tennis courts and through some buddleia bushes. It is completely open to the public, and we plan to make it more obvious and accessible. But for now, it's good to have it slightly out of the way because this gives it a chance to establish. I say this because a lot of the trees are so small that you wouldn't realise they are trees and possibly step on them. It was planted earlier this year in March and also features a small space with several benches that can serve as a picnic area and an outdoor classroom. Our tiny forest is an urban-based nature solution that aims to combat flooding and heat stress while increasing and enhancing biodiversity. My colleagues this morning have already talked about how greening the grey tackles flooding and heat loss, so I'm going to focus on the biodiversity aspect. Next slide, please. So firstly, let's look at our trees and shrubs. There are 16 different species in the plot, and they aren't just biodiverse in terms of being genetically different, but are also structurally biodiverse. You can see that despite being the same age, they really vary in height. Our cherry trees have already shot up so that they're so tall, I can't reach the top of the leaf by stretching out, but our holly trees are still just the size of my hand. This means that each of them can support a unique assemblage of creatures and plants, but this biodiversity is intentional. We picked the trees that we planted, so let's move on. Next slide, please. Almost straight away, we had wildflowers appear in our tiny forest. These pioneering species which spread quickly are typically seen as weeds, but I did put that in quotation marks because what we see as a weed varies from person to person. So for example, I absolutely love dandelions, but I know my dad would mow them down without a second thought. We encourage all wildflowers to grow in our tiny forest so long as they don't pose a threat for the trees. So the creeping thistle you see on the left, that actually really spread and covered some of the smaller trees. So we did have to remove some of them because we want it to be a tiny forest. We want the trees to survive. Next slide, please. But I do love weeds, and I love them because they go on to support our pollinators, including the most ornate of pollinators, butterflies and moths. On the left, you can see a list of species which were recorded over the summer. And the ones that I've shown a picture of is the red admiral, small copper, the Jersey tiger moth, and the common blue. So from now on, I'm going to ask you to think twice about removing weeds in your gardens, in the street, in parks. This is because the results of the big butterfly count this year revealed that the decline of butterflies and dayfly moths is continuing and as worse as ever, and they really do rely on these wildflowers. Next slide, please. We've also recorded these two awesome amphibian species. The smooth newt was just recorded last month during a community monitoring day, and I photographed this toad just the other day as I was popping by. Both these species are protected by UK law, and it's incredible to have them in our tiny forest. Now, I could go on and on and on and talk about bats and birds and all these creatures that our tiny forest will no doubt support. But if I do, we'll be here till 10 o'clock. So I'm going to draw it to a close and say it's clear that this is a biodiversity success story. Next slide, please. But maybe you don't want to take my word for it. Maybe you want to see it for yourself. So again, this is open to the public. Feel free to pop by at any time. Or you can get involved at our community care days and our monitoring days. So you can find out when we'll next be in the park. Unfortunately, we were in the park today, so it might not be till next month. But yeah, you can find out when we're next having these workshops by either visiting Earthwatch website, signing up to our Climate Connects newsletter, or by emailing us directly, and we'll let you know. And just before I hand back to Emily, next slide, please. I'd like to share the good news that we have 2 more tiny forests planned, and we're looking for the community to get involved. If you can think of a place that we might be able to add a tiny forest, please, please, please do get in touch. We'd love to know. Thanks very much, and hopefully we have some time for some questions, so I'll hand back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Simone, for that whistle-stop tour of the tiny forest. Absolutely beautiful pictures there, and amazing to see what has happened in just a year. So I'd really encourage everyone to get involved in those community monitoring days. I know they've been lots of fun. So now we've got time for a Q&A. So I'm going to pause the recording. Thanks for that, everyone. So finally, just before we wrap up, what is on today? If you have a look at the programme, which is on lbhf.gov.uk/climate-carnival, you can have a look at some of the events that are happening today. We've usually got a couple of webinars in the afternoon and lots of events happening out and about all over the borough. So please do have a look. We've got over 50 things happening this week. So please do check out the programme and get involved if you have time later today. And finally, just before we wrap up, please do sign up to our newsletter. So this is a monthly newsletter all about climate action taking place across the borough. We talk about what we're doing as a council, things that are happening in the community, things you can get involved in, as well as what we're reading and sharing. So if you head to the climate pages on our website, you can sign up for Climate Connects. And finally, that's us for this morning. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, to all of our speakers for presenting, and for everyone's questions and comments. That's our generic email address there that comes through to me. So look forward to speaking with you there, and our web address as well. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week.